Susan Smith, the most hated mom in America, was recently denied parole after serving 30 years of her life sentence for murdering her two young sons. Although the public was overwhelmingly opposed to her being released, I do believe there are some legitimate legal arguments that could have been made to justify her release. So join me in this legal deep dive in defending Susan Smith trial by fire. What's good, people? 30 years ago, Susan Smith was given a life sentence for the murder of her two young sons, aged 14 months and 3 years, wherein she put them in a car, pushed the car in a lake, and drowned them to death. She was 22 years old at the time. Initially, she lied to the police and told them she was carjacked by a black man who stole the vehicle with the children inside, but later confessed to the murders. Now, when her case went to trial, the prosecutors actually asked for the death penalty, but the jurors, after hearing all the information, decided to give her a life sentence instead. Fast forward, 30 years later, she went up for parole and was summarily denied release and will have to stay in prison. Now, although they were well within their discretion to deny her parole, I do believe there are some legitimate legal arguments that would have justified her release. Arguments I call mitigation. Now, I know it's easy to make the emotional response and just say, hey, what she did was so horrible, what she did to her sons was just tragic, she should rot in prison for the rest of her life. Well, whatever. That's not a legal analysis. That's something people do when they're sitting on the toilet, typing on Twitter. That's not what we're doing here. So let's start with the basics and talk about the law of South Carolina regarding the sentence of murder. Now, currently, the law in South Carolina is if you were sentenced for murder and receive a life sentence, life means exactly that. It means life, day for day. You do not leave prison until you're in a box. Not even in a casket, they put you in a box. That's what life sentence means today in South Carolina. Now, at the time Susan Smith was convicted, the law was different. At that time, if you were convicted of murder and got a life sentence, you were eligible for parole after serving 30 years, which is why she came up for parole. Now, why that is significant is what that means is when the law was created regarding the penalty for murder, the law contemplated circumstances could exist where although a person was convicted of murder, they could still be released under certain circumstances. But one of the first things I want to address is the violation she committed in prison. Yes, there was some misconduct while she was in prison. There was some marijuana use. She had sex with some guards. There was even an infraction for unlawful communication with an unauthorized person by telephone. Those are all things that happened while she was in prison. And I honestly don't think any of those should be given significant weight in determining whether or not she should be granted parole. I'm going to start with talking about her having sex with the guards. And I truly understand why they want to make her the villain in this situation. I mean, she's the one in prison. She's the prisoner. She didn't break any laws. These guards have all the power over her. They have control. So for them to have sex with her, I mean, you really could make her out to be the victim in this case. And even if she consented, there's a legitimate argument that consent was made under duress where she felt like she didn't have a choice because they had the power over her. Keep in mind, she was 23 years old when she went to prison. You can make a very, very valid argument that she was a victim of a sex crime. Next, let's talk about the marijuana use. Whatever. This country is full of teenagers and college students that use marijuana all the time. When they are caught, do we decide their life is beyond redemption? No, that's asinine. So to use marijuana use after 30 years in prison as a basis to deny parole, I think is absurd. And I do think that most people forget that when she went to prison, she was a 23-year-old lady that had been living in a very small rural town her entire life. So when you think about the level of maturity and sophistication she had at that time, it could not have been significant. And I will ask you to think about what goes through the mind of a 23-year-old woman that believes she's going to spend the rest of her life in prison. I mean, what do you think? she's gonna sit there and just read her Bible every night? I highly doubt it. I mean, she's probably terrified. She's probably mentally and emotionally a wreck. And honestly, I think she would do just about anything she can just to get through the night. And when you think about it, she was in prison for almost 11,000 days. So I think anyone, no matter what their age, man or a woman, if they're in prison for 11,000 straight days, they're gonna have a few bad days in there. I mean, there are people who aren't in prison that have great lives that have bad days and make mistakes on a regular basis. What's significant in my mind is during no time during that 30 years do any of her infractions involve violence, involve weapons, involve fights, involve fighting guards, or anything that I would consider significant. Now, we looked at her life in prison. Let's talk about her life before she went to prison. Now, this 22-year-old girl in this rural town, when she was 6 years old, her father committed suicide. Her mother remarried, and her stepfather started sexually abusing her and having sex with her when she was 15 years old. By the time she graduated from high school, she attempted suicide twice. By the time she was 22, she found herself married, separated, and caring for 2 young sons, primarily by herself. This young woman clearly had mental health and emotional issues that needed help. And I can guarantee you she was not getting it. During that time period, mental health, depression, postpartum depression, those are not things that were normally recognized and addressed. Think about the 22-year-olds today. They get depressed and need counseling because they're bullied on social media, or because their last year of high school, they had to have their classes online and didn't have socialization. Think about the people that are in therapy because of the stress of trying to have it all, a career, a family, a life. That's what our country is like today. Now, this same 22-year-old girl, she got none of that therapy. She got no counseling. She got no self-care encouragement. Now, of course, there are gonna be people that always say, well, I was depressed, I was abused, and I didn't kill my kids. Well, that's great. It's great that you were able to be so mentally strong, you could overcome the challenges and difficulties in your life and move forward, and that's admirable. But everyone does not have that ability. Some people truly need help with mental health. Susan Smith clearly did not get that in her life. I'm gonna call it like I see it. Without a doubt, what Susan Smith did was horrible, and she deserved to be sentenced for murder and served every day of that 30-year prison sentence. However, with everything we know today about mental health and postpartum depression, she was clearly a young woman that was experiencing severe emotional trauma for which she was not receiving help. And when you consider the fact that she was not receiving that help at the time of the murders, I do believe there's a legitimate legal argument or mitigation that she should have been granted parole. So, do you think Susan Smith should be granted parole? Do me a favor, post your comments and call it like you see it. That's it. Well, that's all I got, but I do appreciate you taking the time to join me on this legal deep dive. I think it's always fun to discuss these topics, tell you what I think, and get your feedback. I would really appreciate it if you took the time to like the video, subscribe to the podcast, and also I'd appreciate you sending me your comments so we can discuss the topics you want to hear about. That's it.